If you are over 70 years of age, you are at the greatest risk of death from this virus.
In a closed community such as Gibraltar, I'd say that nearly everybody will at some point get it.
The care will be high class.
The whole point of lockdown is to stay inside.
When the COVID comes in, we hear that the frontier is going to shut down.
If you have symptoms, call 111 and self-isolate.
When I heard that she was in hospital, it was a massive shock. I couldn't believe it. With all the problems that she has with her health and her age, I thought, she's going to suffer, she might not survive.
A girl that comes to help me, that she had fever and she came. And my daughter immediately, perché finite, perché...
This suggests that there is likely to have been sustained transmission over a period of several weeks.
I don't like wearing them because I find them uncomfortable, but look, this is the times we're living in.
It's almost exactly a year since the pandemic gripped Gibraltar, and we're going to review those 12, actually probably more like 15 months of the pandemic, and I'm joined by Christina Cortes. You've been reporting on it for the past 15 months pretty much, because I think our first story on Newswatch was in January. Can I ask you to cast your mind back to the early days and what your initial impressions were of COVID-19, the coronavirus?
Well, I've been looking back over this year and just seeing how it unfolded, all of it. It is like reading a horror novel almost. You know, it's like reading Stephen King's The Stand or John Christopher's Empty World. Like when we look back at January, our first story on this was on the 24th of January. We had an interview with Dr. Bhatti where he said at the time that you should not be alarmed unless you are coming from China, but also highlighted that the GHA was getting prepared. And it's at this point, there were only 26 people dead from this virus in the world. Now we're up over 2 million now. Today. And looking back on that, it's just the early signs of it. And it was the occasional story. Like I said, that was our first one. And then you start to see it creeping up the bulletin. Obviously, in March, everything became COVID.
Sure. So when you say it's further up the bulletin, it means that it's taking more and more priority.
Yes, exactly. So we'd have the occasional, this is the first mention of COVID, and then you see the occasional mention of it. But obviously GBC is a Gibraltarian station, and our focus is on Gibraltarian stories that affect Gibraltar. So we will report on worldwide stories when they are of significant impact for Gibraltar, but we will always look for that local impact specifically. And you can just start to see it creep closer, especially when cases start to arise in Italy and Spain. And of course, it was from Italy that Gibraltar got its first case. So it starts to basically creep closer to UK, to Spain. The WHO declares early on again in 2020 that there were more cases outside China than within it for the first time. And as you see that, we start to see those stories creep higher and higher up the bulletin as this became more and more of a story. And obviously at the time, there were inklings and there were warnings, and medical professionals were warning about it from an early stage. But life was still going on very much as normal around it. We had, for example, the abortion referendum, which was the focus of a lot of our programming at the time, as you well remember, since you had to change a viewpoint at short notice.
On that basis, we've taken the decision this afternoon, all of the four party leaders in Gibraltar, to postpone the referendum to a date to be fixed by the Parliament when we are advised by the public health authorities that it will be safe for people to come out and vote.
So it's basically how this became the story almost of the year. And one thing that's been quite notable about the last few years in GBC has been that, you know, we've always had a variety of stories, but there have been two predominant stories that have gripped us for years now, and that's COVID and Brexit. And at times it's felt like that has been the two poles around which we've been revolving.
At first, the coronavirus seemed like a distant problem, but I think that the way that the pandemic unfolded in Italy and moreover Spain really brought home the threat.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Italy was one of the first countries to be really badly affected outside China. And we all remember those reports initially from Italy of hospitals being overwhelmed. We remember people singing from their balconies while in lockdown. And I think one thing that illustrates looking back is that we've known from early on how bad this pandemic could actually be.
That it'll spread quite widely. What I can't tell you is how quickly it'll spread. Ideally, we would want to delay its spread. Why would we want to delay its spread? Because we don't want everybody, absolutely everybody, to fall ill at the same time. If that happens, then when people want to go to hospital, our staff will be ill. I would say in a close community such as Gibraltar, I'd say that nearly everybody will at some point get it.
And one thing that this year has really illustrated is the importance of facts and of information and the power of media, and also unfortunately the power of disinformation and of insularity from people thinking, well, it can't happen here, even though there's evidence of it happening elsewhere at the same time. And I think it's interesting when you look back how early on it got so bad for some people.
Sure. So there's a variety of and many diverse opinions expressed on social media, for example. But to state the obvious, the GBC newsroom always tries to check its facts and make sure that when it puts out a particular news item, that it's reliable.
I think it has emphasised the importance of legitimate news and trusted fact-checked sources, because we have definitely seen a rise in disinformation throughout this. Some of it innocently enough spread, and some of it very much ideologically driven.
Okay, I'm sure we'll return to that in due course. Let's visit some of the key dates, the Spanish state of emergency, and then a lockdown shortly thereafter. The 17th of March was when flow across the Gibraltar border was restricted.
Yes, so we had, so the virus came to Spain, it came across the border, and the border has been one of the as you mentioned, one of the running themes of this year is that fact that Gibraltar has homes and jobs on either side of this border. And the worries about being able to cross were an early factor. We've had many reports on that. And also the fact that once again, we've started to see it touch hospitals and people just across the border from us. And that initial Spanish lockdown comes in lockstep with the measures that started to be implemented in Gibraltar. So we had large events being cancelled. We had the referendum cancelled at the last minute, as we've mentioned. Flights were beginning to be cancelled. And I think that's one thing that, now we've been used to it, but this idea of being cut off was very frightening at the time. And the night that I will always remember is the 13th of March, when bars and restaurants were announced that it was announced that they would be closed from 8 at short notice. And that night we had a live press conference straight into Newswatch from Number 6. And this is not something, we've been used to it now. We've had daily presses, but this is not something that was normal. This would be saved for extremely rare and really significant occasions. And that night was, I think, when it became the new normal. It's a phrase that's been used a lot. But that was when the daily press coverage started, and when that need for daily information about it, because things were just changing. I mean, a day or two later, the restaurants and bars were closed fully. And around this is when the sheer amount of information, I mean, we ended up with bulletins that were 45 minutes long. We took the decision. And the whole thing was about COVID, because there was so much happening. People stranded in Morocco, panic buying, counters being closed, and then the donations starting to come in. And one thing that I remember is that we had one bulletin in which we had a story about the Metropolitan Police taking over the investigation into the collision at sea.
Which resulted in death.
Yes, exactly, the collision at sea that saw two people die. And this was our last story in that Newswatch. Every story before it, and probably over 20, was about COVID. That's the extent to which this became all of our lives.
And the number of news items and the length of the GBC bulletins just increased to reflect how much we needed to communicate.
Exactly, and most of it was about GBC's role as a public broadcaster in disseminating information and obviously questioning what was happening. We also tried to include some of the human element of it as well, which was sometimes a struggle to fit that in with the sheer amount of other facts that we had to be putting across. But there was very much a focus on that. For example, in the first lockdown, when we had live links from estates around Gibraltar, one memorable one at Varelbeg, where our colleague Kevin Ruiz had a long stick with a microphone on the end of it to speak to somebody on a third floor, I think, balcony. And there are images like that that stay with you from the pandemic, especially those early days of community spirit, as well as extreme, obviously, anxiety and unprecedented changes to our way of life.
Nathan, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, just bear with. Now, Nathan, you're staying at home for the weekend. So what has your week been like? Have you been practicing this all week?
Basically, I have work and home. Going out for the bare essentials, maybe putting petrol in the car and back home. Just want to keep my family safe from this virus.
Donde nací quiero estar junto a ti, gran piñón. Toma.
So we're talking about a period in which Gibraltar had moved into lockdown.
Yes.
And the first major restriction in that respect was on over 70s who were asked to stay at home even before the rest of us were. So they endured an extra long period of isolation.
So let me be clear. If you are over 70 years of age, you are at the greatest risk of death from this virus. That is why, with great reluctance, but with resolve, we have changed our law to provide this additional protection for our vulnerable citizens. Please follow these new rules. If you are over 70, do not leave your home unless it is to purchase essentials or medicines, if you cannot otherwise get them. To go to the doctor, although we will try to make other arrangements for remote consultations or doctor's visits. To care for a loved one. To go to work if you really have to. To exercise a pet if you really have to. To go to a bank if you really have to. Or where you need to move to avoid other risk of injury or death. Or indeed for any other activity, but that is absolutely necessary, not otherwise.
We knew, or we went through the war, we knew the many hardships. So this is again a battle against a virus.
We've all got sort of family members and know people in that demographic. It was a particularly difficult time for them.
Absolutely. I think, since then we've all experienced what it's like to be in lockdown, but it's something to remember how much of this has affected the over 70s, obviously in terms, as we saw later on, of the actual effects of the virus, but also in terms of that isolation, which was, again, like you say, one of the first measures to be introduced. It's just been an incredibly testing year all round for people, and especially them, and also anybody related to them, anybody who, just everybody. We've just lost a lot of the things that we took for granted in terms of being able to see our family members and see our friends and loved ones.
Be out as little as you have to. Get home as quick as you can. An invisible killer lurks amongst us, and you can do your bit to slow its passage through our city by observing these rules. And if you have symptoms, call 111 and self-isolate. And we have not hesitated to act when required. We will not hesitate to do what we have to do in order to slow the spread of the virus. I know it will be hard also for you. Whether you own a business or you work in our economy, or even if you're not presently working. If you're running a business that is covered by the regulations, please notify your employees as soon as possible. If you're able to, do not open tomorrow.
And at the other end of the age spectrum, children obviously also impacted by the pandemic, schools closing on the 23rd of May, if I'm not mistaken, not knowing when those doors were going to open again.
Again, there were many images from that. I believe you did a report at the time on one of the schools closing that was quite impactful, especially considering, again, this is such a normal thing to go to school, to socialise, to be with your peers, and especially for children who, especially younger children who don't really perhaps understand what is happening and who are naturally tactile, for one thing. And it again is all these unprecedented things that we've seen and how we've had to work our way around to deal with those things. And schools, later on we had the reopening of schools, and it brought new issues. For example, Legionnaires' disease, which was, again, there's lots of little things throughout this year that you forget how things have rolled out and how unusual the entire process has been and the toll that it's taken.
Definitely.
Doing exercise should not become an excuse to have a picnic. Taking the dog out or throwing the rubbish should not take all morning. The whole point of lockdown is to stay inside.
So we saw active cases spike in Spain and Italy, and unfortunately many thousands of deaths followed those spikes. In Gibraltar, there was a sort of an eerie feeling to those days because we were expecting a spike and we were aware of the risk and the threat, but it didn't materialize then.
Yeah, well, I remember the day that we had our first case, which came from Italy, of course, and that was I was in early March, and by the end of March we'd had a rise to 35 cases, but we didn't have that, as you say, that spike. In fact, one of our heartening stories from the time was the fact that we had an 89-year-old person surviving COVID, who we then interviewed.
I think it was of a carer that, when a girl that comes to help me, that she had fever and she came. And my daughter immediately, "Perché venite? Perché?" She stayed about half an hour. But that's why I tell you, don't receive anyone from any place.
When I heard that she was in hospital, it was a massive shock. I couldn't believe it. With all the problems that she has with her health and her age, I thought, she's going to suffer, she might not survive.
And I think it's been very well organized compared to something that we never expected. And they've been very good.
I think at the time, as you say, there were some countries in which this was going terribly, and then there were other places that still hadn't grasped the seriousness of it or hadn't been affected by the full brunt of it, and we were one of them. That also coincided, the same day that we had our first case coincided with the UK releasing its COVID action plan, but Prime Minister Boris Johnson boasting of shaking hands at a hospital with coronavirus patients. I don't think everywhere caught up to the reality of what was happening at the same time, and the reality didn't hit everywhere at the same time.
And he went on to get sick and to spend time in critical care.
Indeed.
And the Chief Minister met him around that time, but he didn't have to isolate, as I recall.
Yes, because enough period had passed.
So the infrastructure, the IT, tracking patients, making sure that we know where everybody is, we're making sure that we know when they come in, how ill or well they are, an anticipated length of stay. All of these things will be exactly the same as in the hospital. So the care will be high class.
If we think about the prominent role that masks are playing in today's Gibraltar and today's world, if you think back to when they first started being introduced, there was obviously difference of opinions on how effective they were going to be and the circumstances in which they were best used.
Definitely the role of masks have taken has gone up. It was actually fairly earlier than we think in 2020, I believe perhaps in April, that they started to be advised to be used in enclosed public spaces, but it wasn't until quite late in the year that they started to be enforced in enclosed public spaces, and that also came along with a rise in cases in Spain and Gibraltar. It is one of those cases in which we had a difference between Gibraltar and Spain because they were compulsory in Spain long before here.
I think it's only fair if the people working there have to wear them, that we wear them as well. I don't like wearing them because I find them uncomfortable, but look, this is the times we're living in.
I think it's good. We have to be as safe as possible, and I know it's a bit of a sacrifice, but it could be worse.
Obviously, the science has changed and masks have taken on a greater role in other countries as well. It's been a case of different countries hitting different landmarks at different points, but the same debates cross-cutting across the whole world.
All of them had been working at the Children's Health Centre and were doing so in the 48 hours prior to the onset of symptoms. This suggests that there is likely to have been sustained transmission over a period of several weeks, during which clinics have been ongoing.
The problems start when the COVID comes in, and we hear that the frontier is going to shut down. And as a diabetic as I am, I need my medicines.
The government has not changed its position on closing Limewall Road. The government will be closing Limewall Road on the 1st of June. What we can't be accused of is one moment of rushing into something, and then we're accused of changing our position because we want to keep on consulting people.
Internationally, Gibraltar received some positive coverage for protecting the over 70s and also care home residents during that first wave. There was an increased emphasis on people working from home, and that brought a lot more video conferencing, which has become something which has become a feature, I think, of many people's lives today.
Indeed, the working from home aspect has been something that not everyone has experienced before, although some places, for example, I believe the betting companies introduced it fairly early on, depending on the infrastructure that different places had and how used they were to working from home. And it is a good thing that this has happened at a time when technology allows for this. If this pandemic had happened at an earlier time, it would have been more difficult. But also, I think the pressures of working from home have taken their toll. I mean, there's been a stark difference in how different sectors have experienced this pandemic and lockdown, from frontline workers doing much greater hours and being much busier to people being stuck at home and missing that social contact and having to grapple with technology that previously was alien. It's definitely been a shift, and it remains to be seen how much of that we will retain going forward.
So I sort of put the question from a perspective of work, but people have used video technology like Zoom and Skype and FaceTime to also just have contact with their relatives because they couldn't visit them.
Yes, again, it has been a minor blessing or a blessing of some sort that at least this has happened at a time when people have had that opportunity to actually see each other. We've seen, for example, visits at ERS having been stopped for obvious reasons, but people still being able to talk to each other on FaceTime. It is obviously not a replacement for in-person contact, but it has been one aspect of this, the technological aspect to this pandemic, both in terms of, like we said, the spread of information and also the different ways in people have had to communicate.
That we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing as we have won the first round against the coronavirus. That is your victory.
The similarities and synergies between World War II and now are telling and often remarked on. During the war, it was the military who were the frontline workers, supported by the emergency services, who are more often than not the first to arrive to help those caught up in the conflict. Today, it is the healthcare workers who are the frontline, and it is they who are supported by the military.
I had cleared with His Excellency the Governor, and I think it is important to record in this House, and had communicated to the Leader of the Opposition that a proper interpretation of the Constitution permitted the appointment of 10 ministers alongside a chief minister.
We have had the politics of cooperation and the public interest, always reserving the right to disagree, always reserving the right to disagree publicly.
My party suffered as a consequence being left out of many cross-party briefings and meetings between the government and the opposition.
If we think back to the summer months, Gibraltar was unlocking, and we seemed to return to relative normality for a period.
I think when I look back at the summer, it feels like it was this long, sort of glorious period when we actually felt slightly more hopeful. But looking back on it, you tend to think of March and December, and everything in between wasn't so bad. But looking back on it, summer lasted very little, or that period of relative peace lasted very little. We were unlocking towards the end of May. We started to have restrictions on gatherings reduced, but by the 1st of August we were meant to unlock fully, and we did not reach that point due to rising cases in Spain. The WHO was warning of a severe situation developing with a second wave in Europe. It really wasn't that long that we had over summer, that brief taste of normality. We had the constant fear of losing air travel as well was something that remained throughout. And again, from a newsroom perspective, this was something that we would check every Thursday when the UK restrictions were announced. And, we had the warnings against people going to parties in nearby Costa del Sol and cases being linked to Marbella. So our period of relative peace of mind was actually, I think, shorter than memory casts it as.
It was just so important because we needed the respite.
Exactly. No, exactly. We remember it fondly. I think that time when we actually were able to feel a little bit better for a bit.
I know people and businesses need to plan. I will there share with you
that the advice we are receiving at the moment is not to move to unlocking. We are likely to hold at phase 6 with certain modifications.